Good morning, everyone. We will start the program in just a minute as we allow everyone to log on. So just bear with us as we see the numbers go up. Thanks for joining. All right, I think I can go ahead and kick it off. So good morning to everyone on the call. Thank you for joining us for the GRESB Real Estate and Infrastructure Nordics results event. My name is Kevin Kirby and I'm an associate on the GRESB member relations team. I'm also joined by my colleague, Katie Graneman, who's also an associate on the member relations team. I support the real estate side of the business and Katie is my counterpart on infrastructure. We're glad to have such a great turnout, especially considering the Nordics continue to be leaders in ESG, as you'll see by some of the results. We're really hoping this will be the last virtual event. I will no longer be in my kitchen and we can actually meet you in person next year. We have a great program lined up for you and we're excited to take you through it. But before I turn it over to Philippa Gill from EVORA, we'll go through some quick housekeeping. So just to note, the webinar is being recorded and the slide deck will be posted online and distributed to you after the event. If you have any questions, please ask them by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We could be quite interactive as those come in throughout the event. And we'll also have some time to answer some questions at 2 points during the presentation. So one after the GRESB results coming from myself and Katie, and the other one will be after the panel. And now I'll turn it over to Philippa from EVORA to kick us off with an introduction.
Good morning. Thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. We're very delighted to be hosting this morning's event, part of our GRESB series. We are, as many of you will know, one of the leading GRESB partners in Europe. I think we did over 150 submissions this year. So GRESB and the results are something that's very close to our hearts and very close to all of our clients. Just very briefly, for those who don't know us, EVORA Global is a privately owned ESG specialist consultancy focusing on real estate, infrastructure and debt. And we work across Europe and increasingly across the globe as Europe continues really to lead the way, other than, as I'm sure Kevin will point out, some pockets. And all eyes really looking at what is driving the market here in terms of what best practice is going to look like, along with some big regulatory changes, which I'm sure will be referred to later today. I'm joined by two great panelists and also my colleague, Matthew Brundle, who leads our infrastructure team at EVORA. And I will let our panelists introduce themselves when we get to the panel session. And I'm sure as much as Kevin is fed up with his kitchen, we are also all slightly fatigued with live by webinar. So we've tried to make this as engaging as possible. Please do ask questions. You've got great wealth of experience on the panel and across GRESB today. And we've hopefully asked some questions that will allow us to have a really strong debate. I'm going to try and let the panelists take the lead on this and not interfere too much. And with that, I think I'll pass back to Kevin. We're going to go through the results and then hopefully have a nice, robust and lively discussion. In case we hadn't all noticed, COP26 is around the corner. And if anyone is managing to avoid it, you've probably got your head in the sand at the moment, because every single time I open anything, which is good news, climate change, climate risk and COP26 is all over it. So these results come at a perfect moment, I think, looking forward. So Kevin, back to you for the results.
Great, thanks, Philippa. So yeah, today, Katie and I will be covering the GRESB high-level results from this year's assessment for both real estate and infrastructure. Additionally, we'll be discussing the exciting new products in our pipeline over the coming months, with the very exciting announcement that our transition risk tool launches in December. Next slide, please. Over the last 12 years of GRESB benchmark, we've grown and evolved to meet the industry needs and challenges head on. 2021 was no exception, and despite the complexities of COVID, the real estate assessment continued to grow, and we're now covering 117,000 assets in 66 countries. Arguably, there's never been a more important time for GRESB and its assessments and our members, and the risks of climate change are becoming evident in what seems like by the month. Next slide, please. So investors, really coming back to why GRESB exists in the first place. It's our investor members. In 2021, we now have over 140 institutional investors with, representing 47 trillion in assets under management. This member base expanded in 2021 to cover 5.7 trillion of assets under management, despite global challenges from COVID-19. Investors are critical to the growth of the benchmark. These investors incentivize their investees to participate in the GRESB assessments, indirectly increasing the benchmark. Of course, this is resulting in higher data quantity, which eventually leads to higher data quality through a better representation of the industry as a whole. Next slide, please. What's really exciting is that in 2021, we experienced a 24% increase globally despite COVID. And this was actually the largest increase when you're looking at the history of GRESB. The listed universe specifically grew by 20%, and the non-listed or private markets grew by about 25%. The real estate assessment now is covering 49 of Peery's top 100 fund managers, and we have roughly 70% coverage of the main global listed real estate indices. Looking at the participation really by region, Europe, perfect, thanks. Europe outgrew other regions when it comes to number of participants, with a total of 784 entities this year, representing a growth of 29%. Also notable is that while Europe has the most participants in terms of reporting entities, the respective GAV, gross asset value, is lower in Europe than America's. America has over 2 billion in GAV, whereas Europe is about 1.35 trillion. Benchmark results. Now we can go into the quick look of the scores this year. So next slide, we'll be looking at the GRESB model. As I'm sure most of you in the call must be familiar with this, the GRESB model. For the ones who are not, this actually represents the GRESB scores according to our two dimensions. So both management component on the y-axis, consisting of 30% of the total GRESB score, and the performance component on the x-axis, which consists of 70% of the GRESB score. Global averages steadily increased over the last 10 years, which with the exception of 2020, when we restructured the assessment. And this is actually back up in 2021. Oceania continues to lead, continues to be the leader, and it's worth noting that Europe has the highest number of new participants this year, which is actually bringing down the average score. Finally, we do receive a lot of questions on numbers of stars and quintiles. So we're providing the cutoff points for the various numbers of stars here on the bottom right, where you can observe that they have also significantly increased compared to last year, which is really just emphasizing the competition. So as an example, an entity that was at the bottom of the 4-star cutoff point in 2020 would need to increase their score by 2.6 points to remain 4 stars. A 5-star entity at the bottom would need to increase by 2.9 points. So yeah, just again, emphasizing the competition. Next slide, please. So this is the same model, but with the country breakdown. So you'll observe that the European countries are pretty scattered across the chart, with wider discrepancies between averages. Again, this is mostly due to a number of new participants, most notably in Italy and Germany. Both of these countries had massive increases in participation, which has led to lower than average scores with so many of the first-year participants. Norway is the highest scorer in Europe, followed by the Netherlands, France, and Sweden. Next slide, please. So performance data. This is where most advanced participants actually differentiate themselves from their peers. And to better understand the impacts of COVID on performance data for GRESB, we created a brief survey to gain some deeper insights into this that I'll touch on as we move through this part of the presentation. Next slide, please. So data coverage. Many were expecting COVID-19 to prevent organizations from efficiently engaging with their tenants in order to collect ESG performance data. COVID-19 was not the obstacle we were expecting, with an overall increase in data coverage percentage across all sectors and for key indicators. As you can see on the slide, we had a 4.3% increase in data coverage in Europe comparing to the 2020 assessment to 2021. And then really coming back to the COVID-19 survey results, we did have some interesting takeaways. And these are just some examples provided by some of our members. So within residential, we actually had a large decrease in the average energy intensity, which is against our initial expectations. This is due to the fact that a lot of residential assets in our benchmark come from student housing, and where students move back to their parents' houses during lockdown, this really moved the sectoral average down. Industrial increase in intensities and data coverage due to uptake in the use of e-commerce products and services. Of course, with retail, foot traffic was reduced, or in some cases, almost entirely eliminated for a significant period. Perfect. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at the like-for-like performance of the Nordic countries. Like-for-like is essentially comparing year-over-year performance of assets with 24 months of data coverage. So overall, we see what I consider a pretty significant reduction in all performance indicators across the assessment. What is really notable is the energy use reductions. Of course, some property sectors may have been influenced by COVID positively or negatively, but still, what a message that we see that between 5 and 10% energy use reduction year over year across the Nordics. GHG also saw significant reductions, very likely due to increased renewable generation, either on-site or off-site in the Nordic countries. And then it's also worth noting just the averages in Europe. So in Europe, for energy, we saw roughly a 6% reduction. And for GHG, carbon emissions, we saw an 8% reduction. Next slide, please. So here we are looking at the energy intensities of the Nordic countries. So of course, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark. So Sweden and Norway are quite competitive with the lowest intensities across the 3 property sectors that are represented on the slide. Sweden has the most energy efficient industrial assets, while Denmark leads in efficiency in office and retail. Finland actually across all 3 sectors has the least efficient assets, but just noting this represents a smaller sample size of assets. Relative to European averages, the Nordics all have lower intensities for office compared to Europe, and the Nordics are generally in line with Europe for industrial and retail. Next slide, please. So this is switching from energy to GHG, so carbon emissions. Here we are looking at the actual carbon intensities across the same 3 sectors in the Nordics. Most notable is the very low carbon intensities out of Sweden, and right behind is Norway. Sweden and Norway both have significant amounts of renewable energy on their electricity grids, and notably higher than Denmark and Finland based on the 2020 data that I could find. Finland is lagging as they still have a relatively higher share of fossil fuel energy generation on the grid. Overall, the Nordics do lead Europe in renewable generation, which is why across the benchmark, their carbon intensities are lower than European averages. Next slide, please. And lastly, we would like to congratulate our real estate sector leaders. So if you could move to the next slide. So yes, congratulations on your exemplary performance in your respective sectors. In the real estate standing investments benchmark, we have Castellum, Hufvudstaden, Mandatum Life, Vasakronan, and Vilborgs. And within the development component, we have Castellum, Hemzo, Kungsleden, and Vasakronan. So congratulations to all of the real estate sector leaders. And now I will pass it over to my colleague, Katie Graneman, who will walk us through the infrastructure results.
Thanks, Kevin. That was really interesting, and also great to see that some of our panelists that are on the call today are doing so well. And I'm sure they'd be happy to explain and tell you a little bit about how come they are doing so well and what kind of processes they have in place. So as for real estate, we'll first talk a little bit about the participation that we're seeing this year, and then some of the highlight results. So we saw a record growth on the infrastructure side this year. We had a 30% increase in number of assets reporting, and a 20% increase, 26% increase in the number of funds, which I'll show in the next couple of slides. Excuse me. For the headline figure, so we had 149 funds and 558 assets, which is great to see that the uptake is really starting to happen, especially after last year. We had over 2,000 facilities reporting this year, 69 countries covered, and over 738 billion in assets under management. So that's insane. It's a number that's really difficult to wrap your head around, but it's really great to see the uptake in ESG across the infrastructure sector. So to highlight some of those in the next slide, please. So if we look at the top graph, we see that both the funds completing a performance and a management component is up by 41%. So that's now 106 funds that complete both components, which means that funds are increasingly reporting with assets that they own. So for those of you less familiar with the infrastructure assessment, I'll show that in a minute, but basically the assets that are reporting feed into the funds that they belong to. And so to see more funds completing both components means that there's also more assets as part of those funds reporting. So it's really great to see. So there's a growing number of funds. Over 71% of all funds, 71% of all funds are getting performance scores by having their assets participate, and that was 64% in 2020. So that's a massive uptake that we see. In terms of regions, Europe is still the largest in terms of participation. Most of those come from the number of portfolios, that come from globally diversified and European-oriented funds. There's an amazing sight to see here, the number of fund coverage. So that means if a fund participates with a number of assets, then they can exclude some of those assets, and maybe some of those assets aren't still reporting. And so in recent years, we've seen an increase in the number of assets that are part of the portfolio reporting. So the coverage of the portfolio itself is increasing, and it's now 83% in 2021. So that's a really positive sight to see as well. It means that their data set is growing and that benchmarking is becoming more accurate because the funds are more comparable. We go to the next slide, please. So on the asset side, like I said before, we've seen a record number of growth. Number of assets reporting this year. Still, Europe is the largest region. 306 assets come from Europe, and as part of those 306, 40 are from the Nordics. The relative growth that we see is coming from the Americas. So that's really a positive side, because the last 4 years have been very rough for the United States especially. So to see that the interest in ESG is picking up again is a really positive side for everyone in the world to see who cares about sustainability. So very positive news there. We can go to the next slide, please. So now talk a little bit more about the benchmark results, so the average scores, as well as some of the interesting performance aspects of those. We can go to the next slide. So as I said, the scores of the asset feed into the fund that the asset belongs to. So the average scores have increased quite a bit this year, and they're really high as a result overall. So the average asset score is 71 in 2021, and for funds, the average score is even 77. So we see that funds do really well in the management component, but that they're also now getting a lot better at getting a good score in the performance component as well. So that's a very positive side. And for your information, the average score for the Nordics was 71. So we can go to the next slide, please. So like the one that Kevin showed, we see here the trend over the last couple of years has been a steady march towards that top right corner when it comes to overall scores, and the percentile lines that you can see as well are shifting towards that corner. And that means that it's becoming a lot more competitive also in infrastructure to get a good score and to do well. And so what would have been the average score in 2020 just barely gets you 2 stars in 2021. So that's an amazing sight to see, and it means that everyone's trying to push harder and harder to get the sort of optimized scores to get assets to participate and to report. So that's hopefully we're going to see that trend continuing in the next couple of years. Go to the next slide, please. So this is the same model, but for the asset assessment, so for assets participating. And again, we see that the 2021 scores made a massive leap compared to 2020. And that, again, a 2020 score that was average last year would have just about been a 2-star this year, and that all the previous year's averages would have been 1 stars this year. So that's, again, a massive change that we're seeing, and a positive trend, I hope. And I also want to highlight on the next slide, the Nordics. Excuse me, I have a cold, so my throat is not optimal, but hopefully we can power through. So we can see that the Nordics are doing very well in terms of average scores. A lot of the countries that we're seeing here, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, are all the average scores are all in the 3-star range. So that's a very high score, and Finland especially leading back when it comes to the performance scores. That's a really great sign to see. Shows that the Nordics are taking some good steps there. And hopefully we'll see that in the next couple of years as well. So very briefly to the next slide. So these are the global asset results. So the average scores, well, the globally diversified, I would say not the most interesting one, because there are not that many assets that fall into that category. So the scores are a little bit skewed. So that's maybe a little bit deceptive. but you can see that the Americas are doing actually really well this year, which is a bit of a surprise to us, honestly, to see that suddenly happening, but also a very positive one, because it means that the continent really does seem to start engaging when it comes to ESG. So that's great. On to the next slide, please. And as to asset sector results, again, we see that there's a massive increase in the average scores for sectors for many years. Social infrastructure was one of the sectors that performed the worst on average compared to other sectors, and they made a massive jump this year, which is incredibly impressive to see after what must have been a very difficult year for many assets reporting in the social infrastructure sector. Remember, that covers things like education and healthcare. Sectors that have really suffered from COVID and have had many furloughs. So to see that score increases is really impressive if you take that into account as well. But across the board, we see that the scores are increasing, which is just the general trend that we have here in the asset assessments. We can go to the next slide, please. And likewise, the aspect results are also increasing, and we see really big jumps when it comes to reporting on health and safety, which is obviously difficult for us to understand why that might be the case. Excuse me. But we believe that might also be an increasing awareness of the importance of this topic. And I'll briefly touch on the next slide too. So we see that for this year, excuse me. Gosh, I'm so sorry. So we see that the average scores for the first year participants are incredibly high this year, and we've just not seen that before. So that's really, again, testament to the attention that ESG is getting and the performance of assets reporting to our assessment. So really great and positive to see. So if we can skip the next slide and we can just go to see the infrastructure sector leaders, please. So these are sector leaders from the Nordics this year. So we have one asset from the Smartcraft, who is an asset sector leader, so congratulations. And we have one fund who got the most improved score, so that's from AIP management, so congratulations on that. Kevin, would you be able to talk about the next couple of slides? I'm so sorry, but I'm completely losing my voice.
No, thanks Katie, thanks Katie for powering through that.
I'm so sorry.
I also have a cold, but luckily I'm not as choked up right now. So yeah, happy to take us through some of the new products. So yeah, that was it for the results. Of course, we will be posting some of our more public results on our website, such as industry trends, market insights, etc. And those will be coming in the coming days and weeks. So yes, I will start with the introduction of the 3 upcoming products. Next slide, please. So first, the transition risk report. In December, GRESB will launch its first transition risk report, which leverages on your existing ESG data submitted in the 2021 assessment that's already on our platform. So this essentially requires no additional input from the participant or the reporting entity. And so for those that don't actually have full data coverage of their portfolios, this report will be able to fill in the gaps and estimate what has not been reported to produce a full picture of transition risk. Finally, the key insights will be built on the global CRREM decarbonization pathways, allowing essentially any entity, whether this is regional or globally diversified, to generate key insights with regards to its transition risk. So more info can be found on the website, and you actually can now access the first version of the transition risk report draft. So yeah, stay tuned for that. We're very excited to be launching this in December. Next slide, please. So yeah, Sfdr reporting solution. So early next year, GRESB will launch its first Sfdr reporting solution. And similar to the way that the transition risk report is generated, this product will leverage on existing ESG data on our platform and allow for an efficient reporting of all participants. It will also require some additional input since some of the Sfdr requirements are not covered by the GRESB assessment. And this product will support the disclosure of both Articles 11 and 7 on the principal adverse impact statements. So on the slide, you can actually see 2 QR codes. So these are links or QR code links to our webinars that are upcoming in early November. We're hosting one for infrastructure and one for real estate. So, if you have the chance right now, of course, you can scan the QR code with your phone and then tune in for those events in November. You can also find these links to the events on our website in the events section. Lastly, we have the Tcfd alignment reporting. So next year we'll be launching our Tcfd alignment reporting solution. As some of you know, several countries, including the UK and EU, have officially endorsed the TCF recommendations as reporting requirements. Given that the full sets of Tcfd recommendations are already represented in a GRESB assessment, this solution will allow participants to benefit from a Tcfd aligned report, but really without any additional input. So there'll be, more info is on our website. And I believe this closes out the presentation from the GRESB side. And I believe we have maybe five minutes for Q&A if there's anything relevant to the results presentations. Katie and I, of course, can assist with those. I do see some chats that I'll get to as we move through the rest of the presentation. So please feel free to ask any questions, or I'll have a look at the Q&A. And if someone could confirm that, I think we're having until 10:30 when we start the next section. I think that's the case. So maybe Philippa, should we just go ahead and move on, and I can address some of the Q&A questions,
Okay,
seeing as
great.
they're a bit specific, so I don't think they're worth talking about now.
Thank you both for that. So I think we've set the scene, hopefully, for a very interesting discussion. If I could just go to the panelists, please, and ask them to briefly introduce themselves. I'm attacked by lots of screens. Anna, maybe do you want to kick off and just say hi?
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, my name is Anna Denell. I work as the Head of Sustainability at Vasakronan.
And Philip, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here, but I guess you have to start my video since I can't start it. But now I'm Philip Elland, and I work as the Head of Sustainability at Castellum.
And congratulations to you both. As if we knew in the future that both your companies will be headlining there. And I'm also joined by my colleague Matthew, who leads our infrastructure team, just to provide a bit of the infrastructure commentary as well. So I really wanted to kick off, I suppose, given you're both sector leaders, with your thoughts on what is this reflecting in terms of reality? I suppose where you both are, what your biggest challenges are looking forward, and how you think this kind of reflects the market position at the moment. Maybe Philip, I don't know if you want to kick off with that one.
Yeah, sure. Well, in terms of where the Nordic market is at the moment, I would say that we are front runners, as you can see in the benchmark. So comparing with our international peers, we have a strong position, and I guess we are dedicated. But then on the other hand, are we doing enough? I guess that's another question. And I guess if you look at emission gap report launched a few weeks ago by the UN, it's quite clear that we are not doing enough. And that is also what is discussed at the Glasgow COP meeting right now. And that the projected plans are not in line with the targets to meet the net zero world by 2050. So actually the emissions still continue to grow, and let's say that the countries deliver on the targets, which we are not doing. We are still about 60% short of the net zero world that we are aiming for by 2050. So looking at this sector, there is a lot to be done. And I could even argue that we are totally missing out of the embodied carbon emissions, which account for the majority of our sector's emissions. So looking at, for example, the EU taxonomy right now, there are no KPIs on embodied carbon, and only focuses on the usage of the energy during the usage phase. And linking that to the GRESB results, yes, compared to other peers, we are front runners, but there is a lot to be done. And being a global sector leader as Castellum, or as Vasakronan for that case, it does not really mean that our business are at the moment in line with the Paris Agreement. There is a lot to be done, and we have to learn from each other and collaborate even more going forward.
Yes, thank you. Embodied carbon, my my favorite subject, but that's for another webinar. Anna, any thoughts from you?
No, I think I can only agree with what Philip just said. And I think maybe Philip is missing one important topic, and that's the loss of biodiversity. I'm not arguing climate is not important, because it is, but I think our industry and many other industries are totally missing the very, very urgency of the loss of biodiversity. And I think some of us are starting to understand how much we impact also that aspect of the environmental impact.
It's very true.
Not only when we are developing new buildings, taking prime farmland or green land into developing that kind of land, but also if you look at the value chain, both in terms of energy consumption and all the building material that we are using, we have a huge impact in terms of loss of biodiversity and consumption of natural resources.
And,
so even if we can reduce the embodied carbon of our new development projects, we still have a task or a homework to do related to the natural resources that we are consuming.
Yes, I think one of the issues is well, all financial industries, but real estate is very good at looking in silos about what we think is the edge of the building and forgetting the fact that those buildings actually sit somewhere, and the somewhere is impacted as well as the actual building. I think for a different perspective, Matthew, any thoughts on, I mean, we've seen enormous growth in the infrastructure, participation in the scores, you know, in terms of this decarbonisation urgency, how are you seeing that across the industry?
Well, I would actually just agree with everything that's just been said. First of all, absolutely pick up on Anna's point, and so delighted that she had spotted that, you know, biodiversity and the loss of habitats is an area which is sort of really not very well, really well discussed and talked about, and really is critical. And actually, to pick up on your point, Philippa, you know, there is this huge connection between the underlying infrastructure, which serves the built environment, and actually many of the challenges are interconnected between the two. You know, we cannot achieve a sort of a net zero carbon future without fully recognizing the interconnection between the buildings that we live in and work in, and the underlying infrastructures that services all of that. And that's one, you know, that's one thing that I really think needs to be brought out by all countries, not just within the Nordic regions. And we're seeing this across all of the sort of regions and the businesses that we help support. What I would also say, one of the trends and one of the big things that I'm a big advocate for is alignment to the UN SDGs, which also pick up on this interconnection between environmental concerns, which we obviously naturally focus in on around the whole climate change debate at the moment. That's quite understandable, but not forgetting the social impacts that come, particularly from infrastructure. There's such a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of resources go into producing infrastructure, and it's important that we don't forget all of the social benefits and also the challenges that come with building infrastructure and running infrastructure projects.
Thank you all. So as the panelists know, often people say, you know, what's going on in South America, which always makes me smile because my mother's from South America. You know, they all speak Spanish, don't they? And I have to mention that there is this country called Brazil. It's quite large, and it doesn't speak Spanish. So I'd really like to start unpicking now in terms of the different regional you know, challenges. I think looking ahead, we've seen from the results, obviously there are differentials, and we talked as we were setting up this panel about, you know, a lot of this is about the underlying infrastructure in terms of decarbonisation. If your entire grid is almost net zero, you're ahead, but to Philip's point, that doesn't necessarily mean you're ahead. And I know you're both based particularly in Sweden, but obviously you have a much better insight into what's going on elsewhere. I just wondered if you could both just comment on unpicking this Nordics region and you know, seeing what the main challenges are across there. I don't mind who goes first.
I can start. Maybe I think there is actually more that unites us, especially if we compare the Nordics towards the rest of the world. But on the other hand, there are differences between the different countries. And maybe, I don't know if I'm the best person to tell you which country is ahead of the other in terms of different aspects. But I would say that the Norwegians are far ahead when it comes to construction in timber. Although we have a large office building now being completed in Uppsala, but overall, I think that.
Oh, we've lost Anna mid word. Maybe you want to comment on that, Philip, while she hopefully reboots and comes back?
Sure. Well, I think,
but also natural resources. And to be honest, I think the Danes are definitely ahead of us there. They are not only reusing building materials, but they are remaking the building material and converting.
Oh, we've lost her again. But certainly looks like she's heading towards circular economy and how we really need to start reusing materials. Any thoughts that, oh, sorry, Anna, we were losing you. I'm afraid we lost most of your circularity comments. But I think very back to the embodied carbon comment. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, Philip.
Well, as Anna said, I think there are many things that unites us. But then, as you can see in the figures that you showed us just earlier, I guess there are some differences when it comes to the grid and renewable electricity and heating, for example, where Sweden may be a bit ahead. And just to give you some examples, actually, Castellum, we are a Nordic player, and we actually quite recently purchased a large portfolio of properties in Finland. And when I look at those properties right now, they are quite similar to many of our Swedish assets, but the carbon emissions are about 4 or 5 times higher per square meter than the Swedish properties. So there are some differences there, I would say. And then I think that, as Anna said, timber construction, I guess we have to learn from each other more there. There is a lot of great things happening in Norway. We also have one timber project in Örebro here in Sweden. So my thoughts on learning, Castellum, we've been a part of a European think tank with 6 other major real estate owners in Europe. So it's kind of the same business idea, but we're not competing since we're on different national geographic markets. And we're collaborating on sustainability and innovation. And even if we may think that we are ahead in some cases, there are nuances between the countries that are quite fruitful. So learning from best practice in each country, I think that collaboration is a big thing going forward, especially now that you can collaborate digitally more in a better way than just a few years ago.
Agreed. I do think the sector is really starting to collaborate in a way that I you know, after some time in this industry, have rarely seen. In fact, we hosted a client roundtable recently in Germany, and I think there was a sigh of relief as anyone around the table was like, you know, now we can actually talk about this openly and share best practice. And given the challenge ahead, I think that's really the only way forward. I wanted to just talk about transition risk, if we can, as well as obviously physical risk.
Sorry, since you lost me, since I was crediting the Danes, I would like to rephrase that or say that again, because I was crediting Denmark for their leadership in terms of reusing of building materials. I don't know if you heard that, but and they are much ahead of us there in terms of not only reusing old building material, but also redesign them and turning them into really cool and nice design products.
So perfect link, I think, to my next question is, what is that driven by? Is, you know, is legislation really starting to drive this? We've obviously seen the European Commission, certainly the first time ever seen legislation that is incomplete put through any kind of parliament, which is quite interesting. But I think a very brave move, and obviously a signal of how urgent this is, to put out an enormous piece of legislation and quite openly say it's not finished and we don't really mind, we have to get on with it. So all credit to the Commission for that. And we all know that it's imperfect. We could do another whole webinar on its imperfections, but it is clearly driving focus and the market. In terms of that circularity, embodied carbon, you know, I suppose the next frontier of, to Philip's point, how do we close that gap now? What are you starting to see in the Nordics in terms of local legislation?
What we see in all the Nordic countries is now mandatory climate declarations related to the construction of buildings. I mean, all the EU countries have had mandatory energy declarations for the energy consumed in existing buildings, but now we also see a law in all the Nordic countries for embodied carbon. In all countries, there are so far no thresholds, but a requirement of developing a declaration at the time of the when the construction project is finalized.
Sorry.
Maybe fill in on some there, because the embodied carbon are a so big portion of our emissions. In looking at Castellum, for example, and I guess we are the only company together with Vasakronan that actually calculate the full carbon footprint of the company. 95% of our emissions come from development, new buildings and refurbishment, and there are actually no legal demands at the moment. So you can build a climate bomb as long as you build it in a way that is as low energy usage during the usage phase. So one could even argue that constructing a new building is not different from digging for oil. At least if you look at the United in Science report launched earlier this year, but that puts cement at the same level as fossil fuels. And this has to change, and we have to focus a lot more on circular materials, learn from the Danes, as Anna said, renewable materials, wooden construction, for example, and go into reused materials and looking at the construction more as a Lego build than let's say a Lego build than a building.
And Matthew, obviously, you know, embodied carbon on the infrastructure side is just pretty much all of it. What are you seeing in terms of industry focus there?
Well, I think it's absolutely right. Embodied carbon is a huge component of looking at and understanding what the impacts on infrastructure are. I think what strikes me as being on the emerging into the debate is sort of using infrastructure and its capacity to help decoupleize further economic growth from sort of environmental and social impacts, which obviously picks up on all of that sort of issues of resource use, circular economy. And I think one of the things that strikes me about the Nordics regions, unlike some other regions around the world, comparatively speaking, it's a relatively low density populations, and therefore the built environment is naturally spread. And of course that spread and actually that interconnection between towns and cities, roads and other utility services obviously spreads and has a greater impact, and the greater you have to kind of provide those facilities. So the real trick to sort of decoupling that further economic growth and the impact that the built environment has is to kind of bring relevant facilities together, closer together, make cities more compact, make them more integrated, making that connection, as I said earlier, between the buildings and the underlying infrastructure, and optimizing the two elements together. And that's really an important part of kind of as a society, bringing the sort of the overall carbon footprint and the embodied impacts and the resource use impacts down to a sort of optimum level. That to me is sort of the real challenge here.
Quite an interesting challenge if you think of it in terms of in a demographic view, though. We're all conscious that we are converging into cities, and cities are going to need to be much more efficient in that way. But that also has an enormous impact on our mental health. And I think the health impact of this whole, both the decarbonisation side and what's got us here in the first place is often overlooked in a similar way to the natural environment. As we densify our cities and as we put more and more infrastructure around them, actually that has a quite serious detrimental impact on the well-being of everybody living in those, unless we build that green and that natural capital back into that infrastructure.
I would argue, sorry Philip, I would argue that infrastructure should also be green and blue infrastructure, and that needs to be a critical part, other than just the sort of the traditional hard engineering infrastructure. There are very smart ways now to build cities such as you can integrate that natural habitat back into the built environment. It's important to get that connection for not just for people, but also for for the environment itself. There's no reason why it needs to all be hard.
Yes, and I think one of the things that happened is we kind of fell out of love with our waterways. They became a bit old-fashioned, and everyone thought it was much better to get on the train or then get on the plane. I'm just wondering what we've seen in the Nordics in terms of, I attended a great city renovation webinar for the city of Birmingham, which is starting to reopen up all its canals. It was a city, very industrial city, built on the canals. That's how it made its money. And then they were really kind of, after the Victorians left, to dwindle away, and they've suddenly realized they have an enormous web of waterways that can reconnect the city back to itself. Are we starting to see kind of looking backwards in order to go forwards in the Nordics? Is that starting to come back, or did you not have the same relationship with the waterways? I've thrown them a curveball.
I'm trying to find an example. And yes, we do see the water in Stockholm being used in a different way nowadays than it used to be the last 50 years, looking more like what it used to look like 100 years ago, with actually boat lines for commuting purposes, not only on the Lake Mälaren, but also on the seaside in Stockholm. So you're right. We are actually seeing that, but I was not aware of the historical perspective of the matter.
I often think, as an industry, it's human nature. Every generation thinks it's cleverer than the last one, but there's a lot of the challenge, I think, looking forward, particularly in terms of using the passive elements of buildings that our forefathers would have done without thinking, because they didn't have all the technology we do, particularly in terms of embodied carbon and making buildings last. As we all know, I find it slightly depressing that the usual lifespan for a building is 50 years, when actually, if you look around us, some of the buildings we cherish most and we love most that keep giving back to the community are much, much older than that. Are there any, we're starting to see from the European Commission the renovation wave, which is really driving the industry towards Anna's point of reuse, reconstituting materials. Is that starting to come out in legislation in the Nordics yet?
No, unfortunately not. Not as a specific targeted topic. It could maybe be considered taken into account when the climate declaration of a new construction is coming into place, and eventually when there will be thresholds, because by using reuse material and by reusing buildings and not tearing them down and develop new buildings, the carbon impact will of course be lower. To be honest, I think in all Nordic countries, what we see is that the building regulation and our laws are actually hindering us from reusing more, and especially from reusing buildings for new purposes. One example is if you would find out that an old office building, and when I say old, think from the 80s, is not fit for purpose any longer, and maybe the location is right for residential or housing. But then we typically find out, at least here in Sweden, that it is not possible to redevelop it or renovate it and turn it into residential units because of our very, very high and strict regulations when it comes to new housing, which is kind of interesting because older housing units or residential buildings would not be forbidden just because they are not complying with all the new laws, so or the requirements for new construction. So I think there is a need to kind of balance the new construction regulations when you're trying to do something good out of what already is. I think there should be some kind of I don't know how to put it, but some kind of lessened burden in terms of what you need to do.
We've started to see that elsewhere in terms of coming out of COVID and allowing buildings to be reused. I think as our final, because I think we're running out of time as always. Philip, any thoughts on mitigation? I think as we look forward, you know, we're all trying to get to a net zero point, but there's a reality of what's going to happen in terms of physical risk, particularly for very large sea exposed regions. Any thoughts really about you know, what's looking ahead for the next, I suppose, 10 years as we really start to see the impact of this happening?
Yeah, I guess we can continue that for one more hour, but we've been discussing transition risk most of the time here, and I guess the physical climate risks are quite clear, especially if you look at the IPCC's report launched this summer. And as you mentioned before, the Tcfd now are a requirement in some countries, and we have to, maybe that would be something that more and more companies will report on. And Castellano, we've been reporting according to Tcfd for quite some years, and also been doing the scenario analysis. But going forward, and especially looking at the IPCC's report this summer and the risk session for the last couple of years at the World Economic Forum, clearly states that climate risks are quite severe and maybe the most urgent risks that we face. So I guess there will be a lot more questions going forward, especially from banks lending money, insurance companies, investors. So, and since real estates are, as I think you said it before, they are based on a location, and the physical risks are there. And I guess we as an industry are maybe one of the first industries that will be seriously analyzed, comparing to other industries that might be a lot harder to analyze. So presenting climate risks and the risks of your portfolio will be very important going forward, and there will be a lot happening just the next couple of maybe 1-2 years.
Philip, are you starting to see, and maybe Anna as well, are you starting to see tenants realizing this in terms of when they're occupying buildings? Are they starting to think about maybe this won't be a comfortable building in 5 years?
No,
I wouldn't say that for the office, but I guess if you look at logistic buildings, we have some discussions, but they are not frequent, I would say. I would say there are more questions from banks and from lenders because they are actually investing money and they see a big risk going forward, and they need to account for that.
Interesting in logistics. So obviously one of the most frequently recommended solutions to decarbonize logistics is to put solar panels on the roof. You know, this is kind of almost like the first box of any recommendation in terms of decarbonizing the asset. But then we were reminded by some collaborators of ours in the insurance sector that is perfect until they're not installed properly, they catch fire and burn the roof down. Or the hailstones that we saw last year, particularly in Eastern Europe, then smash all the panels because they're at precisely the right angle to be hit by a nice fat hailstone. So I think a reminder to all of us that we need to look laterally, not just straight ahead in terms of the longer term impacts. Which leads I think, Matthew, to a question. You know, obviously infrastructure timelines stretch much further out, we hope, than other buildings, rightly or wrongly. In terms of this, you know, particularly as they're often exposed, in terms of this physical risk, what are we starting to see in terms of the questions that the investors and the developers are starting to make?
Well, I think in terms of the key infrastructure, so power, water utilities and waste management, and then of course transportation, I would say are kind of the key areas. In terms of the Nordics regions, obviously pretty good starter already in terms of your sort of renewables capabilities with access to geothermal, hydropower, biomass and so on. You're in a pretty good position there in terms of sort of the long-term future to be net zero. Where I see to be challenges will be around the water flows management control. We're beginning to experience this, of course, ourselves in the UK with increasing downpours. And what we're finding is a lot of our systems are simply not able to cope with the capacity of downflows. And I believe that's the same situation that you have in the Nordics. So, you know, that whole water infrastructure environment is going to be under threat. And that will obviously transpire into kind of potential for pollution getting into the Baltic and into other water courses and so on. And that will have then ramifications on the fishing industry and so on and so forth. So I think, that is one area where I can see there's a very significant challenge ahead. The other one, of course, is the transportation sector again, which is similar to us in the UK, but given the sort of geographic low density of population cities in and around the sort of Nordic regions, that interconnection between cities and how you do that sustainably. As we said earlier, how do you optimize urban living and still make it habitable, but still recognize that those interconnections between urban environments and need to be low and sustainable as well. Those are the two sort of key areas I would see would be of particular challenge going forward within the Nordics regions. Philip, you're still on mute.
So last year. To Philip and Anna, really, in terms of if we put aside the I think what everyone would think is the obvious water impact in terms of physical mitigation, what are the other risks you're seeing? Is it wind? Is it the change in changing weather patterns? Also back to Anna's point about biodiversity. What are the ones below the obvious water risk?
I think the most important risk to pay attention, being a property owner, especially if you're a long-term or long perspective property owner, is the sea level rise, because that's kind of that will erode the property value now when people find out that this property is located in the wrong location. Other risks, I think we are able to mitigate going forward by paying attention to climate risks when renovating, managing, and maintaining our buildings. Flash floods, of course, are also important to pay attention to. And if the location is, that can occur anywhere, but what you need to pay attention is how is your building located in terms of like low points in the area, and what kind of system is there from the municipality side to take care of stormwater and so forth. And there are also things you can do if you plan them ahead and try to make room for them in your yearly kind of budget. So I'm not very afraid of those, but sea level rise, of course, is hugely important.
Philip, any thoughts on other?
Yeah, I guess soil erosion is also one big risk, moving soil, and then of course since we own assets that are used during the day, we have cooling, so technical issues and making sure that the comfort levels are okay, because in a warmer climate, and we already face it during summertime today, there is a lot of technical issues, and the older buildings are not made for those high temperatures, so you can't actually use the office space in some cases during the summer if you don't work with it, as Anna said, and upgrade properties and so on.
But that will not happen overnight. So if you plan for that and make
but the heat
wise decisions or plan for it, I think I cannot tell for other companies' portfolios, but there are things you can do about it, and it will cost some money, but I think we will be able to financially cope with it, because those costs compared to the overall property values are not significantly high. I would like to make another remark, if I may, Filippa.
Of course.
Because all of you now have stated that climate is urgent, and I echo that, although I wanted to bring up another topic. And you've all also used, maybe not you, Matthew, but the rest of you have been using the net zero term. And nothing makes me so afraid than that terminology or that concept. Because I think there is a huge risk that we are allowing ourselves high emissions now and kind of fooling us that it is being mitigated when it is actually not. We are kind of compensating only by not allowing other stakeholders in other parts of the world emitting the same amount of carbon emissions or climate greenhouse gases.
I mean, in terms of the what's called the equality of decarbonization?
No, I'm not saying that we are not supposed to decarbonize our own emissions, but there are different schemes, different concepts where you allow yourself to emit greenhouse gases and kind of compensating them, getting yourself to zero or climate neutral or any other terminology, by, for instance, buying carbon
offsets.
Offsetting,
yeah.
Yes, offsetting.
Yeah.
But actually those offsettings are not leading to any removal of carbon from the atmosphere.
So this is a debate we have quite often internally.
Accounting. Yes, we are doing it ourselves, but we think there is a need for an open dialogue about this, not only in the real estate market, but in the whole kind of business society, because we are kind of window dressing ourselves with the carbon neutrality, null CO2 here in Sweden and in the other Nordic countries as well. And I think there is a huge risk that we are fooling ourselves and also making fools of ourselves and actually doing more bad than good.
Very valid. Sorry, Philippa, go on.
I was going to say, I think there's a whole separate webinar on what to include in your different scope emissions and honest and transparent disclosure. I do think the Commission has put a flag in the ground in Europe very clearly about not only what everyone has to report on, but what good looks like. And I think the concept of do no significant harm is very, very important in terms of making the industry not just decarbonize, but also look sideways at what else it's doing. But I mean, we have this debate internally a lot. We are waiting for regulation of the offset market, because we advise lots of our clients on how to offset. Obviously, there's a hierarchy within the best practice decarbonization in terms of, and I agree, net zero, but it's the word we're all using, in terms of, no, you can't just run to the grid and hopefully, you know, say, oh, well, the government will save me, but in the meantime, I will write a large check and plant some trees that I will never see. But I think the one thing that will change that is public scrutiny, and we are seeing increasing amounts of very intelligent public scrutiny coming into the area, whereas before I don't think many of the stakeholders fully understood. We're seeing shareholder action really drive behavior change, and we have seen very recently, actually, whether they were right or wrong, but we've seen calculations made by the market, the wider market, in terms of what it will cost people to decarbonize and companies, which has caused ripples, certainly in the public sectors. So I think a lot of companies, certainly at the kind of leadership end, are starting to think about, well, how do we not just disclose what's happening now, how do we actually disclose impact? Not just the impact of what we're doing right now, but the impact of the plans we have in place to decarbonize. But the sooner we get to a regulated offset market, I think it will be safer for everybody. I'm just conscious of time, and I wanted to ask one last question, which is the upskilling question. As many of you will be aware, the market levers are really now directed at the investment market. ESG is no longer something that is peripheral to what we were doing every day. As real estate investors, as global investors of any kind, both TCFD, Sfdr are all written in finance language, and they're very much assumed correctly, in my opinion, that climate risk is financial risk. So the language, you know, when you start to talk to the heads of risk in some very large companies, they are often the ones who get most comfortable fastest, because they realize, oh, it's just, as it were, just another risk, and I know how to deal with this because I deal with risk every day. We are seeing you know, a lot of very successful professionals suddenly being faced with ESG risks in their portfolios, in their funds, and in their assets. And I'm just wondering, in terms of your own internal mechanisms, and then I'll come to Matthew to round up, how is that risk starting to be upskilled across the business? Because certainly now, as I'm sure you two can comment, one single head of ESG cannot possibly manage this across the entire portfolio.
No, and I guess if I start, I think that you have to, as I guess we all are trying to do, is integrate it into the business, so that, for example, if you work with property development or you work with finance, you have to form some kind of a council or some kind of collaboration within the company, because the ESG risks are everywhere, but somehow you have to work together with the different functions within the business to actually get the full picture. That is one thing. And I guess another thing that is driving this, and I guess that also links back to what you spoke of before this, the transition risk and the net zero, and one gap that is closing right now, I think you said it, Philippa, is that the next generation can actually smell the greenwashing. And as a company, you have to be transparent. You have to be open to the challenges that we face. And as Anna said, net zero, or we have to focus on actually what we can do. And then hopefully the trading schemes and so on will be handled and tackled by the COP meetings in Glasgow. Hopefully, at least they would discuss it. But all companies need to be transparent, and ESG risks are real. And stating that everything is rainbows, unicorns, and great will not work in the future. You have to be open and transparent to actually show how your company is doing in all of these different aspects. Otherwise, we will not solve the major challenges moving forward as a sector, as a nation, or globally.
Anna, any thoughts from you about how you're upskilling internally?
I think we've worked in a way for a very long time, so there is actually not a need for that to be able to fulfill all new kind of reporting initiatives. But I think there is a need for true leadership and to be honest about the real impact of your business. That's where there is a need, not only at Vasakronan, but in all companies, I believe.
We just wanted to answer one of the questions that's come in from the audience, and maybe Matthew, it'd be interesting to know what you've seen with the clients that we're supporting. The question from Anna Ronisto is: have you started to do EU taxonomy aligned climate risk assessments? And I'm wondering, Matthew, what you're seeing in terms of the clients that you're supporting in terms of how they are looking at that risk across infrastructure.
I think it's fair to say that it's still relatively early days. I think people are still struggling to get to grips with how to turn what is conceptually quite an easy thing to understand. I think we can all appreciate the challenge. What then becomes the challenge is how do you turn that into something practical as a deliverable? And that's really where I find most of our clients are sort of struggling to make that connection. And really picking up on some of the points that you've just raised, really around kind of working together. What we see is obviously the language of ESG and sustainability is broadly understood and everybody gets, and we all want to move in the right direction. What we do struggle with is sort of interdisciplinary working. I know a lot of organizations talk about multidisciplinary, which is sort of working across a range of different areas, but working in specific sort of technical disciplines and so on to deliver solutions. What we really need, and a lot of our clients are struggling to do this, is to work interdisciplinary, working with our working with our core expertise and background, working across disciplines and working towards joint practical solutions. And I think as part of that comes also a willingness to also engage with innovation. What I see a lot within the sort of infrastructure world is that the industry works in very set ways to very specific and set standards. They don't like to deviate from those standards, perhaps because, you know, there are contingent, you know, or contingent liabilities, particularly with the longevity of which some assets kind of have to sort of run for. You know, some like water infrastructure assets have to be capable of running for 1,000 years, not a few decades. So I think there's the willingness to kind of go and explore innovative products, technological solutions, ways of working. All of those things are where I see the real main drivers for change needing to occur at the moment. And conceptually, I think people get, you know, the broad understanding of ESG. It's just making it practical and implementing it through those organizations and on those projects.
Great, thank you all so much. I know always with this we could go for another 3 hours or 3 days, but thank you all for those insights and those comments. Congratulations again on your results. And I'm now, we don't seem to have any more questions at the moment. Any last questions from the audience? If not, I will hand back to the GRESB team.
Yeah, and I'll take over. I've taken some strepsils, so hopefully I won't start coughing again. Thank you for that incredibly enlightening panel. That was really interesting. And I always find it very interesting to hear these perspectives as well on the ground, because we at GRESB, you know, we have our assessments and we talk to our members, but I always find it incredibly insightful, and it makes such a big difference in the work that we do, making sure that whatever we're requesting, the information that we're collecting is rooted in reality and is meaningful, and having these discussions, I think, is very important in relation to that. So thank you very much to our panelists for that, and also big thank you to EVORA for hosting this and setting this up with us. It was hopefully very insightful to everyone who attended today. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions to our events team, and I wish you all a very pleasant day, and thank you again for attending.